Chapter 26, Part 1 of J.S. Bach, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Catherine. J.S. Bach, Volume 2, by Albert Schweitzer. Translated by Ernest Newman. The Magnificat and the St. John Passion. Part 1. BG 11 Magnificat, BG 12 the St. John Passion. On the great feast days the Magnificat was given in figurative music at the evening service in Leipzig. It followed the sermon. Bach twice set this poem, Luke 1, 46 through 55. One of these compositions for solo soprano has been lost. Rust, in the preface to BG 11, says he saw the score in Den's possession about 1855, so that a work of Bach's had been lost before the very eyes of the editors of the great Bach Gesellschaft edition. Of the other Magnificat we have two scores, an older one in E-flat major and a later one in D major, representing the definitive form of the work. The first edition, published by Simrock in 1811, was based on the E-flat score, Polchau, the editor, not becoming acquainted with the other until a later date. The clean copy of the D major score, which was made about 1730, surpasses in beauty even the autographs of the St. Matthew Passion and the Christmas Oratorio. Bach probably wrote the Magnificat for the evening service of Christmas 1723. So at least we may assume from several movements, not forming part of the text, which, according to the older of the two scores, were inserted between the verses of the Magnificat. After the Et exultavit, Vom Himmel hoch da komm ich her, was sung. After the Quia fecit came Freut euch und jubilieret. After the Fecit potentiam came the Gloria in excelsis. After the Esurientes implevit came the hymn Virga Jesse floruit. These hymns were not rendered by the choir that stood beside the great organ, but by some choristers in the small gallery opposite, accompanied by a smaller organ. It seems that these hymns were part of the Leipzig evening service. Kuhnau had written a cantata upon them. Spitta conjectures that in Bach's time the medieval rocking of the child was still customary at St. Thomas's, although the council as early as 1702 had insisted upon the abrogation of the old custom. Footnote: see Rust's preface to BG 11 and Spitta 2, 372. The texts of these additional movements were taken by Bach direct from Kuhnau, whom he follows in using the Gloria, instead of the accepted but wrong Vulgate version, Et in terra pax hominibus bonae voluntatis. The more correct translation of the Greek original, Et in terra pax hominibus bona voluntas. Instead, however, of declaiming the last three words together, as the sense demands, he makes nonsense of them by separating bona voluntas from hominibus. The added movements will be found in BG 11, page 101, and the following. End of footnote. Bach's Magnificat, according to this view, would really be stage music accompanying the representation of the scene in the manger at Bethlehem. If the Magnificat were sung on other feast days, the extraneous numbers would naturally be omitted, which accounts for Bach not including them in the D major score. This became the property of Emmanuel. We know from a textbook that has survived that he gave the work in this form in Hamburg in 1779. As the time allotted to the Magnificat in the evening service was fairly short, Bach had to adjust his music accordingly. It has not suffered by this. Its admirable concision exhibits the beauty of the music under the best possible circumstances. The first chorus is dominated by the joy motive in uninterrupted semiquavers. Although three trumpets are used here, the instrumentation is not at all thick, for Bach employs the wind with extreme care. This holds good also for the Fecit potentiam and the Gloria. Perhaps in the Gloria, the vocal triplets ascending and massing above each other are too orchestral in style for them to give the effect we anticipate. The fugue upon Sicut locutus est was one of the pieces in which Zelter found many things to censure. He would have liked the comes more uniform in shape and the fifth voice more correctly introduced. Although this chorus is marked a cappella by Emmanuel, it must be accompanied by the harmonies of the organ. Even in the tender trio Suscepit Israel, Bach would not have dispensed with the organ accompaniment. The silence of the contrabass and bassoon only signifies that the instrumental bass is to be given out by soft 8-feet stops. It is advisable to have 4 or 5 voices to a part in this movement, so as to get the right fullness without doing any violence to the cantus firmus of Meine Seel erhebt den Herren in the oboes. Perhaps Bach's organist assisted in this melody with some light registers. In the bass and in the cadences to the soprano air Et exultavit, we hear the characteristic Bach motive of joy, as though a blinding ray of sunlight suddenly vibrated through the gentle Advent twilight. This motive is usually not heard by the audience. It disappears in the excessive diminuendo that is usually foisted on the cadence. The bass that accompanies the additional chorale Freuet euch und jubilieret, added in the Christmas performance, is merely a rhythmical transformation of this motive. In the soprano aria Quia respexit humilitatem, the lowliness of the chosen maiden is expressed by figures descending and bowing, as it were, that give rise to an accompaniment of indescribable charm, a veritable musical picture of the Madonna. Even in the Ecce enim ex hoc beatam, where the voice sings the fame of her who shall be called blessed to all time, the accompaniment retains this motive of humility. The Et misericordia, in which the muted strings and the flutes give out ritornelli that seem to come from a super-terrestrial world, should be sung, wherever practicable, not by 1 but by 3 or 4 voices. The chorus Fecit potentiam is built upon a broad theme that proceeds by haughty intervals symbolizing the word strength.
Fecit potentiam, fecit potentiam.
In the accompaniment to the tenor aria Deposuit potentes de sede et exultavit humiles, Bach employs 3 motives. One in descending motion represents the words He hath put down from their seats. Another, one of the powerful step motives that appears in various forms now in the bass, now in the violins, indicates that it is the mighty who are thus treated. A third motive that ascends gently expresses the words, and exalted them of low degree. The meaning of the motives is confirmed by the fact that they reflect the declamation of the various sentences. It must be borne in mind that the fine ascending line of the theme of Exultavit humiles only makes its proper effect when the violins phrase it not thus, but thus. The accompaniment to the Esurrientes is made out of 2 motives. The first, a species of the joy motive, is like a sunny smile. It belongs to the words, "He hath filled the hungry with good things." The other is a softened version of the motive of the Deposuit. It symbolizes emotion, in terms of which Bach conceives the words, "The rich he hath sent empty away." In performance, of course, the two motives must stand out clearly from each other. The joy motive must be played piano. The other must enter forte, and the tempo must quicken slightly. Footnote: the more spiritedly and heavily these semiquaver sequences are played, the better. They must give the impression of lively resentment. In the cadence of the prelude, bar 7, there is a transition to the joy motive. This bar must of course be played in a piano subito. One is almost tempted to add the strings each time to the flutes in the spirited semiquaver passages. End of footnote. If the two motives are thus contrasted throughout the movement, the hearer will at once recognize their meaning. We unfortunately do not possess the figured continuo part of the Magnificat, so that the difficult task is thrown on the organist of selecting the harmonies from the mass of the voices, and completing them according to his own feeling. In many of the solo numbers, especially in the Quia fecit mihi magna, where there are no instruments playing, very few will succeed in rendering the part to their own satisfaction, and that of the hearers. The St. John Passion was probably the first that Bach wrote. If the St. Luke Passion be really his, this would be the first. Spitta, however, scarcely makes out his case for its authenticity. It is indisputable that the score is in Bach's writing, but as soon as we try to date the work, we run against insurmountable difficulties. Spitta attributes it to the first Weimar years. This is inadmissible, for the cantatas of that period are incomparably more mature than this Passion. Nor does the autograph belong to this epoch. It dates from the Middle Leipzig period, and so would force us to suppose that Bach, in the years of his greatest mastery, made a fresh copy of an unimportant work of his youth, just as it stood. This is impossible. He never took up an earlier composition without fundamentally improving it. We know, on the other hand, that he applied a much lower critical standard to the works of other men. The most natural supposition, therefore, is that he copied someone else's Passion about 1730 with a view to performing it. Perhaps in doing so he touched it up here and there, which would account for the fact that there are occasional traces of his own genius in the insignificant work. No importance is to be attached to the inclusion of this Passion in Breitkopf's catalogue of 1761. For that uncritical time, everything found among Bach's papers in his handwriting was his own work. To the practical musician, it is a matter of pure indifference whether the St. Luke Passion is proved to be authentic or not, since he will hardly ever be tempted to perform it. As Agricola and Emmanuel in the Necrology give the number of the Passions as 5 without detailing them, it is quite possible that they too regarded the St. Luke Passion as an original work. How summary their enumeration is may be estimated from the fact that in the preceding rubric they lump together many oratorios, masses, Magnificat. There were really then only 4 Bach Passions. Of these only 2 have come down to us. The 2 lost ones came after the St. John Passion, one of them probably a year or 2 after this. In 1725 Picander published his Erbauliche Gedanken auf den grünen Donnerstag und Karfreitag über den leidenden Jesum in einem Oratorio entworfen. As it was for Bach that he wrote almost all his remaining church texts, it is practically certain that the composer commissioned this Passion oratorio from him, and set it to music. The text is as wretched as it well could be. For the Gospel version, Picander substitutes a short versified narrative of the Passion. In the aria he attains the climax of tastelessness, as the following examples will show. Evangelist. Und endlich kam die Mörderschar mit Spießen und mit Stangen, und Judas, der ihr Führer war, gab Jesum nach gemachtem Schluss. Der Feinde Raserei gefangen, da wollte es Petrus wagen, mit seinem Schwerte drein zu schlagen. Peter, Aria. Verdammter Verräter, wo hast du dein Herze? Haben es Löwen und Tiger verwahrt. Ich will es zerfleischen, ich will es zerhauen, dass Ottern und Nattern die Stücke zerkauen, denn du bist von verfluchter Art. In the third part of Pikander's poems is the text of a Passionsmusik nach dem Evangelisten Marku am Karfreitag 1731. Bach not only commissioned this poem, but even prescribed the form of the verses. Being unwilling that the music of the Trauerode he had written in 1727 at the death of Queen Christiane Eberhardine should lie unused, he wanted to convert it into a passion. Picander did his work satisfactorily. Bach had simply to write the text of the opening and final choruses, and 3 arias of the new poem, under the old music. Footnote: Rust was the first to point out the relation to the Trauerode to the Lost Passion of 1731, in his famous essay on Bach's frequent employment of the same music for new purposes. End of footnote. Thus we probably possess the finest part of the St. Mark Passion. We need no longer look for any new discoveries in connection with Bach's passions, as was at one time hoped. When Spitta undertook to date the St. John Passion, he did not take into consideration the possibility that Bach might have produced it in Leipzig in 1723, some weeks before his appointment to the cantorship. He took it for granted that it was composed in Köthen, on the ground of the paper on which some of the parts are written. He also assumed that the text was compiled and the music composed in some haste. He afterwards shows, however, that the haste was to no purpose, Bach not being nominated until after Easter. But it is hardly probable that the council would allow the Passion music, which in 1723 it was the turn of St. Thomas's to give, to be suspended on account of the vacancy in the cantorship. It would be more likely to look out for a substitute, as in the case of the cantatas. We know that though there was no cantor at the new church in 1729, the Passion music was not omitted, but was undertaken by one of the candidates. We may assume the same procedure to have been adopted during the vacancy at St. Thomas's. Of all the candidates Bach lived nearest, he could easily come at that time, as there was no church music in Köthen. We know that after the new year he began to work at a Passion, and wrote out the parts. It is therefore practically certain that the council had commissioned him to undertake the Passion music for 1723, and that he complied by producing the St. John Passion. This was the third Passion music in the modern style that the Leipzigers had heard at the Good Friday evening service. In 1721, Kuhnau had been compelled to write a Passion in the operatic style he hated so cordially. The text of the St. John Passion is founded on the celebrated poem of the Hamburg councillor Brockes, a poem which Mattheson, Handel, and Kaiser had set to music. Bach, however, makes use of it only for certain arias. For the bombastic versified narrative of the Passion, which the other composers thought such a fine poetical achievement, he substitutes the text of the fourth Gospel. From Brockes' arias he only takes isolated ideas, which he then works up freely in his own way. Here he must have had the assistance of someone with a sensitive poetic faculty. The new version is noticeably better than the original. It avoids the insipidities of this, and turns its dramatic ideas to better purpose. Compare, for example, these two extracts. Brockes. Bei Jesu Tod und Leiden leidet des Himmels Kreis die ganze Welt. Der Mond, der sich in Trauer kleidet, gibt Zeugnis, dass sein Schöpfer fällt. Es scheint als Lösch in Jesu Blut, das Feuer der Sonne strahlt und glut. Man spaltet ihm die Brust, die kalten Felsen spalten, zum Zeichen, dass auch sie den Schöpfer sehn erkalten. Was tust denn du, mein Herz? Ersticke Gott zu Ehren, in einer Sintflut bitterer Zehren. Bach. Mein Herz, in dem die ganze Welt bei Jesu Leiden gleichfalls leidet, die Sonne sich in Tränen kleidet, der Vorhang reißt, der Fels zerfällt, die Erde bebt, die Gräber spalten, weil sie den Schöpfer sehn erkalten. Was willst du deines Ortes tun? Soprano. Zerfließe meine Herze in Fluten der Zehren, dem Höchsten zu Ehren, erzähle der Welt und dem Himmel die Not, dein Jesus ist tot. We are tempted to assume that the delicate unknown poet who assisted in the St. John Passion was the same who supplied the text of the cantatas Sie werden aus Saba alle kommen, number 65, Mein liebster Jesu ist verloren, number 154, and Du wahrer Gott und Davids Sohn, number 23. At its first performance, the St. John Passion had not its present form. It began with a chorale chorus, O Mensch, bewein dein Sünde groß, which now comes at the end of the first part of the St. Matthew Passion. It contained 3 arias, Himmel reise, Welt erbebe, zerschmettert mich, ihr Felsen und ihr Hügel, and windet euch nicht so, geplagte Seelen, which Bach replaced by others at some later performance of the work. It ended with the chorale Christe, du Lamm Gottes, which was afterwards transferred to the cantata Du wahrer Gott und Davids Sohn, number 23. These alterations were probably made for a new performance of the St. John Passion in 1727. In place of the deleted numbers, Bach wrote a great introductory chorus, Herr, unser Herrscher, the arias Ach, mein Sinn, erwägte wie sein Blutgefärber Richten, the arioso Betrachte meine Seel, and the final chorale Ach, Herr, lass dein lieb Engelein. For a still later performance he went through the parts and improved certain details. Footnote. Altogether we can deduce from the parts 4 performances of the St. John Passion under Bach himself. End of footnote. To this revision belongs, for example, the instruction that in certain parts of the first chorus only the violoncellos and bassoons are to take the quavers, while the contrabass and the organ take each time the second crotchet. At the same time he marked the phrasing and the dynamic indications in the parts. These successive redactions are deducible from the state of the various parts. End of chapter 26, part 1.